Previously on the American Justice Podcast.
As a veteran, I wouldn't believe another damn word that comes out of this man's mouth. There's a reason why beer is so cheap at American Legions and VFWs, so veterans can drink lots of it.
There is an epidemic in America's criminal justice system. The prosecution and conviction of innocent people for crimes they did not commit. Welcome to American Justice. The American Justice Podcast Army works to free men and women wronged by the criminal justice system. It's not only about the innocent who have been imprisoned, but also the victims of the crimes as well. No one deserves justice more than them. And now, here's your host, Scott Pogensy.
Hello, AJ Army. Welcome back to your podcast. This week, we'll be covering the first part of Day 3 from the trial of the state of Wisconsin versus Vincent Cosey. Today, we'll go over the map with the impromptu witness from U.S. Cellular, and it promises to be a treat the likes of which we've never encountered before. Are you ready? Aren't you ready to spend the day hearing a cellular phone technician talk about signals and carriers and gigawatts and such? All 1.21 of them? Also, from the defense's side of things, I'm sure it will be full of likes and you-knows and giving us the epitome of professionalism. Are you ready to hear about that one time at cheer camp? Wait, maybe there's a few of you out there that are, so it might be a good idea to skip that. Give me a P, give me an E, give me an R, give me a V. All right, okay, enough of that. Let's get going. First thing out of the gate, we begin this day of the trial with a big fat lie. The judge asked the jury if they've seen or heard anything about the case since the day before. They all gratuitously say no. The judge believes them. Hilarious, but not really. Believes them or is just beyond giving a shit. I'm not really sure. But of course they've heard and seen things. This is probably the most talked about thing to happen in Racine County since the invention of eye holes in sheets. Tim Baker, our cell phone guru, finally takes the stand. Crayon-filled resume and all. He's repeating most of the information we already know from the day before, but in front of the jury this time. As if boring you and I to death wasn't enough, he's going for the whole courtroom this time. He produces a bill belonging to Vincent Cosey, and it's placed into evidence showing the call logs. It's too bad no one is allowed to borrow someone else's cell phone to make calls. Wait, you can? Then what does this prove? Absolutely nothing. Remember, this is all pre-smartphone era when Google tracked your every move. All you had to do was leave your phone at home or give it to someone else, and bam, instant alibi. Remember Sister Charla from season 1? The one that every night had about 4 to 6 hours of non-use for her cell phone, presumably sleeping, and then the night of the murders had almost 12 hours of non-use? Well, there you go. Point proven. Mr. Baker explained the different columns on the phone bill in regard to who placed the call and whether or not it terminated to another U.S. Cellular customer or a landline. Caveman speak from 15 years ago when compared to the technology we have today, I'm certain. He's even explaining call waiting and call forwarding. I'm sure this is riveting information in 2006 Wisconsin and may not be suitable for the elderly in the audience, especially with the recent revelations of indoor plumbing and electric light bulbs. I kid. Oh man, I just had a thought. Do you remember how expensive our cell phone bills were in 2006? Yikes! They were bank-breaking unless you were one of the poor folk like me who opted in for prepaid cellular. That way I couldn't make a call if I couldn't afford it. The judge asked the expert to speak up for the 100th time since the beginning of the trial because there is no microphone. Shouldn't these have been delivered with the indoor plumbing and electric light bulbs I mentioned earlier? Microphones, people. First invented in 1876. Google. It's free and it's in your pocket. Tim Baker is going to demonstrate his wizardry on a map, but the jury can't see what he's doing. Convenient, I guess, if you're trying to railroad someone without any evidence. Luckily, Joe the bailiff comes to the rescue and helps the prosecution move the map. How big of a map is this that it takes 2 grown adults to move it? Why don't courtroom transcripts come with photos? Since we're all on a roll Googling things, Microsoft PowerPoint was first invented in 1987. Man, that would have made Bill and Ted's history report so much easier if they'd only known.
Bogus.
On the realistic side of things, this courtroom in question sure could have used some PowerPoint 19 years after the fact. Nope. We're lugging maps all over the place so sleepy jurors can pretend like they know what the expert is talking about. The judge has to instruct Miss Morales from the defense to move to where she can see the map as well because she's going to be the one doing the cross-examination. The defense attorney doesn't do this of her own free will? Are these people even trying? You're a goddamn defense attorney, and the judge just noticed that you weren't even paying attention in her courtroom? In your own case? This isn't high school math class, folks, although I'm sure someone has stuck their gum underneath the witness stand at one point or another. I'd be willing to bet money on it. Using the map and bill sheet, the expert is pinpointing Vincent Cosey's location by his cell phone activity. The prosecution asked the witness to translate the 24-hour, quote, military time format for the standard 12-hour format because somehow simple mathematics aren't necessary in smarty pants law school. Amazing. I'm sure this doesn't surprise anyone who is currently listening to this podcast. Has anyone involved in this case impressed you up until this point? I'm just curious. From what I can tell, they're allowing him to testify using the color-coded map that the judge said couldn't be used the day before because it was only given to the defense the day of trial. Of course, no one is objecting to this at all. We are 3 days into this trial, and I can still count on one hand the number of times anyone has objected to anything. They must not want to upset the balance of the annual Racine County Courthouse Ping Pong Tournament and Cheese Festival coming up in the following weeks. You wouldn't want to object to an obvious atrocity and then have to face off, paddles, balls, and all, with Jennifer the Tank Adams. Oh, the obvious tension that would cause. Wait, hold on. I've spoken too soon. Holy shit. Miss Morales objects to something. She believes that the direction the car is traveling cannot be determined by which cell tower is pinging the suspect's phone. I mean, she's absolutely correct, but the judge, who isn't a telecommunications expert, overrules the objection because, slam dunk wrongful conviction and all. Are we sure Texas Ranger Jeffrey Collins doesn't have a twin brother in Racine County, Wisconsin? A sort of less rootin' and less tootin' Midwestern counterpart? She objects again because the prosecution is leading the witness and it's sustained. Welcome to the party, Your Honor. And they do it again. Sustained. The mini-thins and the coffee have kicked in and they're all acting like professionals. I actually thought I was going to make a 90s early 2000s joke with the mini thins, but just found out those things are still available for sale in the Midwest. God bless the tired eyes of the Midwest when it comes to those abominations. Legal speed. Gotta love it. Basically, the expert witness can tell which zone the phone was in and that the phone was moving, not the direction the car was traveling. He certainly can't prove that the phone was in Mr. Cosey's possession, though. For all we know, it could have been tied to a rogue deer and let loose in the woods. I mean, it happens in Wisconsin. Now it's time for cross-examination by Miss Morales, even though she didn't seem to know this part was coming until the judge reminded her. Tax dollars at work, baby. Tax dollars at work. We determined that Mr. Baker is only working off of a portion of the billing record since text messages are billed separately. Houston, we have a problem. A recurring problem that seems to flourish regularly on the American Justice podcast. The phone records are incomplete. Who would have thunk? The prosecution is objecting left and right because they obviously did not think of all this nasty text messaging business when they were formulating their evil plan to put an innocent man behind bars. Finally, the defense is awake. But for how long? They must have gotten into the judge's mini-thin stash. The pom-poms have been dropped and they've brought out the big guns. Now, there's even an objection as to which type of phone plan Mr. Cosey is on. Does he have free nights and weekends? Holy crap, free nights and weekends? Personally, I'd forgotten about that nonsense from the early days of all this cell craziness and laughed out loud when reading it in the court transcript. I hope you did too. The state's objections are overruled in accordance with the subpoena. U.S. Cellular was supposed to provide an expert witness who understood the ins and outs of all the documents provided by the telecommunications company, and here he sits. Clueless, but here he sits. But does that matter? Hell no, of course not. They just keep asking him questions even though he's pretty much rendered useless as a professional witness. He explains that it can be determined when a customer sends a text message, but impossible to determine where on the map that customer is when the message is sent. Finally, in cross-examination, it is determined by the expert witness that there is no way to determine that the phone was in Mr. Cosey's possession during the time in question, just that he is tasked with the responsibility of paying the bill. Logic, ladies and gentlemen. Isn't it a beautiful thing? The biggest thing that I want to point out here is that the prosecution was able to establish that Vincent Cosey was probably within about 3 miles of the murder scene at the time of the crime. They do this by pinpointing a call Vincent made to his ex-girlfriend, Janet Ward. But this fact is never disputed by Vincent for 2 reasons. First, he didn't know where he was exactly at the time of the murder because he had no reason to remember where he was from around 8:50 to 9:10 p.m. Second, Racine County is so small that if you were anywhere in Caledonia, you are going to be within 3 to 5 miles of where Stephanie was found. Nick from the True Crime Garage and I talked about this very fact when we got together to discuss the case.
I do know that the prosecution was able to present some cell tower evidence. Let's use that word evidence very loosely. That suggest he would have been in a certain mile radius of where she would have been killed. They're not saying, hey, we've pinpointed and his phone was exactly where she was killed. They're saying, no, this cell phone tower information would suggest he was within miles of where she was killed. But then again, we say, let's use that word loosely, evidence, because we've seen other cases where we've had testimony, expert testimony of people that come forward and say, well, you know, if one tower is overloaded or for any number of factors, your phone call could have pinged off of this tower, off of a neighboring tower instead of the one that you were closest to. Mm-hmm. And it could happen for a multitude of reasons. So we talk about reasonable doubt. It's hard to even put the accused with the victim at the time of death.
Let me just read this from the appeal real quick. And this is what the justices that heard the appeal are putting in their opinion. It says Joyce Ward, Cosey's former girlfriend, testified that Cosey called her work at 8:47 p.m. Cell phone records confirmed that Ward's testimony that she called Cosey back 1 minute later. They also showed that the call was routed from a tower located less than 3 miles from where Goines' body was found. Now, when I first read that, I kind of had one of those moments like you have. It's like, oh, wait a second, hold on. So we're saying that he was within, these certain miles at 8:47, which is pretty close. I mean, I think her body was found at 9:06 or something like that, and so this is pretty close to the murder window. Well, I started doing some research, and I went and I looked up Racine County, and more specifically the village of Caledonia. And Caledonia is only about 5 or 7 miles wide. I mean, it's really, really small. And so pretty much anywhere that you're in Caledonia, it's going to be routing off of these. I think there's 2 or 3 cell towers in the whole town. So
just to clarify that and underline it for everybody in case it slipped past the goalie there. How many miles so the prosecution, everybody needs to understand, this is one of the things they're building their case around. This is evidence to say, they're using this as evidence to say he was with her at the time that she was killed.
Right.
Because they do not have any witness that was willing to testify to say, my 2 eyes saw the 2 of them next to each other. They don't have that. So they're going to use all this of, well, I saw 2 people. It could have been them. I had no way of telling the gender or race of the people I was seeing because it was dark. But what they're going to do is it's like a layer cake, right? You're putting one layer and then a second layer and a third layer and a fourth layer and a fifth layer. And soon enough, you've got this big, beautiful cake, and it's too beautiful that you cannot walk away from it. You cannot resist this beautiful cake. You end up eating the whole thing. And so when they say, we got these people that say they may have seen them together, they're saying they saw 2 people, but don't know who they were. They saw a vehicle that somewhat matched the description of Vinny's. They saw this, and icing on the cake, we got this cell phone tower that says, Scott, that they're saying at trial says they were how many miles for the cell tower information?
It was routed within 3 miles of the cell tower was within 3 miles of where her body was found.
So the cell tower is within 3 miles of where her body's found. How big is the space of Racine that we're talking about?
It's approximate so Caledonia it's kind of a rectangle shape.
Okay.
It's shorter on the top end, but it's a little bit wider. So at the widest spot, it's about 7 miles wide, and on the tallest, it's about 5 miles tall. So it's about 5 by 7 miles.
So this 3 miles is a big chunk of that.
A huge chunk, because if you're 3 miles away, and then let's say
Cosey and Stephanie Goings the only people that live in this 3 mile chunk of this space? No, right. I mean, if you're going to use this as evidence that he was with her at the time that she was killed, it seems to me like you could put a percentage of the population that could have been with, if that's what you're saying tells us that they were next to each other at the time, then you can put a decent percentage of the population that says they were with the victim here at that time.
Yeah, probably about 90% of the population of Caledonia. Yeah. Because if it's let's just say it's right there in the middle of the town or the village, then that's going to be if you're 3 miles away to the west and the body was found 3 miles away to the east, and that just happens to be the cell tower that's right in the middle, then you could be 6 miles away. You could be in a whole nother town.
Yep. And again, in other cases in other states, there has been expert testimony in those cases that say for a multitude of reasons, your call could be rerouted to another tower. So we cannot say definitively based off the information they're presenting that he was even within 3 miles of her at that time.
Mm-hmm. I also asked Vinny about this information, and here's what he had to say.
It was pointed out in trial that you had made a call a couple miles from where her body was found. Do you remember that?
And like the dude from the phone company said, basically, the phone call could have ticked off from any cell phone tower at that time. But I was all over through Racine that night anyway, though, so I was somewhere everywhere, but I was by myself. That's the whole thing to the thing. I was by myself the whole time. I was never with nobody.
Finally, Mr. Baker gets to step down and take all his complicated maps and bills with him. Can we please have an easier witness next time? The state tried their best to shoehorn him in on the defense at the last minute, only to have him proved to be worthless to their case. Maybe that is why cell phone bills were so high in 2006. No one, including the quote experts who worked there, knew how it all truly worked. Sergeant Stouse takes the stand. He's the sergeant at the Caledonia Police Department. He was the officer who responded to the dead body call on 4 Mile Road. We determined that Caledonia is not a town. It's actually a village. This is common in the upper Midwest and on the East Coast. A foreign concept to us Southerners. Let me lay it down in some easy-to-understand terminology provided by writer Kaylin Barron. She breaks it all down rather easily in an article called City versus Town versus Village. She says, quote, "City and town are often used interchangeably, as are town and village. However, there are several distinctions that make these three terms unique from one another. Let's start with the smallest of the three terms. A village is a small community or an incorporated minor municipality. It is smaller than a town and usually located in a rural area." End quote. Town, defined by Merriam-Webster as a, quote, "a compactly settled area usually larger than a village but smaller than a city," end quote. That all sounds pretty vague, but it's important to note that a town is distinguished by defined boundaries and a local government. Finally, according to Merriam-Webster, a city is considered, quote, "an inhabited place of greater size, population, or importance than a town or village," end quote. Now, I personally don't think it matters much about any bearing on this case, but what I do think is important is the government part. Notice that villages don't have a working government. So, with that being the case, why or how does Caledonia, a village, have a police department? Being from Texas, I think I'm officially more confused about Midwestern villages than I was before reading that article. Google. It's free, in your pocket, and sometimes it's confusing. Now, back to Sergeant Stouse. When he arrived, he saw a white male, Bradley Rittenhouse, standing next to the road and a black female lying in a ditch. Why do I get the feeling that there would have been an immediate arrest if these colors were swapped? Just a thought. Color aside, I believe this Bradley Rittenhouse guy would have been my first suspect until proven otherwise. After all, they have just as much evidence proving this guy killed someone as they do proving Vincent Cosey did. At least they have this guy at the scene. Arrest him and straighten everything out later. Maybe that's not a very, quote, white option in Racine County, Wisconsin. So back to the witness. According to the testimony, Stephanie was lying face down with her head to the west and feet to the east. Sergeant Stouse determined she was dead by checking her pulse and her eyes. There was no response. He could see blood oozing from the wounds on her back and head. The paramedics arrived and determined there was nothing else they could do for her. He then took some yellow tape and roped off the crime scene. Now this is where our listeners from Season 1 of the American Justice Podcast need to pay close attention. How to Handle a Crime Scene 101. At least they were outdoors and it was already dark. No need to turn the lights off and stumble around the crime scene in complete darkness there, Jeffrey Collins. I promise I'll stop shaking my head in disgust as soon as I can have Brandon Woodruff, a free man, and sitting next to me as a guest co-host. So Sergeant Stouse positively identified the body from the contents of her purse. The body was lying on top of a purse and the purse was closed. The officer doesn't recall a cell phone being found at the scene. I personally find this strange even in the year 2006. Sure, cell phones weren't as widely used as they are today, but they were still super expensive and very personal. If they didn't find her cell phone in the purse or laying on the ground nearby from falling out of the purse, that tells me it was probably taken. More than likely, it was taken by the killer and or killers. Find that phone, and you find your mystery gunman. But then, we already know that the police never found her cell phone. Still, it would have been pretty convenient for a man waiting on site with the body before the police could even arrive to pocket that phone. But remember, we know that Stephanie had her phone because she talked to Felicia Jones just 5 or 10 minutes before all of this happened. But don't worry, folks. Bradley Rittenhouse was never investigated as a potential suspect, so don't expect a huge WTF moment later in the trial. Still, if I was a killer... Ms. Morales, already on a hot streak from cross-examining Mr. Baker, decides to do the cross on Stouse. The officer determined Stephanie Goins' address from her ID and contacted the Racine Sheriff's Office for assistance. The officer actually read and studied his own reports in preparation for the trial. You'll have to excuse my surprise. I'm not used to this sort of behavior. In the past, the defense attorney has always had to remind the person on the stand of what they typed in their own reports. The officer states that the people inside the residence next to the crime scene did not hear any gunshots. I'm suddenly lost on the cross-examination. The defense asks the officer about every single thing he may have in his vehicle on a routine shift from ink pens to gloves to paper. I'm not even sure where this was supposed to go other than a total waste of time. Were they close to a break? Did someone have to use the little attorney's room? Sergeant Stouse steps down. What in the hell just happened? Was there a cross-examination for the sake of just cross-examining? Why not just say, no questions, Your Honor? This man had access to legitimate information, and I somehow feel a proper chance to cross-examine him was wasted by cheerleader number 2. Maybe they should have spent some time asking more questions about the guy that just happened to be right next to the body when they arrived. Still, if I was a killer. It is brought to the court's attention that Ernest Cosey, Vincent's brother, has been brought from the penitentiary on a bench warrant to testify on behalf of the state. They're worried how the jury might see him. It is determined that clothing has been dropped off for him as well. At this point, I don't think it's going to make much of a difference if the jury sees an inmate in inmate's clothing, especially when it comes to a member of the Cosey family and the criminal history they all seem to possess. The defense wants him in civilian clothing, but the prosecution wants him in jail garb. He's their witness after all. Not sure why this matters so much either, but ultimately it is up to the court and the judge on how he's allowed to be presented to the jury. The judge is worried about their own security, and if a person from the prison system being in street clothes is a security risk. This is officially the most reasoning I've heard coming from the side of the bench since I started reading the court transcripts to write this or any other episode of the American Justice Podcast. Of course, if he escaped, he'd be identified after stepping onto the street. Remember, no one is a stranger to anyone else in the village of Caledonia, county of Racine, Wisconsin. Officer Leketwicz takes the stand. Here we go again. This podcast host is going to have to take some kind of linguistics class or something. Sally says so hell, I still don't have it.
And now, hang on to your hats. Keep your arms and legs inside the ride at all times, because it's time for a rider's note from head rider C. Derick Miller.
Is anyone in this case named Smith or Jones? From a writer's perspective, these names are getting really hard to spell. I can't imagine what it's going to be like to pronounce them, Scott. Good luck.
All right, so Officer Leketwicz is an officer at the Caledonia Police Department. He performed some evidence collection and stated that Lieutenant Stannis found a possible ricochet mark on a utility pole at the crime scene. That was basically all the state wanted to establish. A ricochet mark on a utility pole. Established and done. Cross-examination. Come to find out, Officer Leketwicz is a little more interesting than what the prosecution would lead you to believe. He was an assistant to an Officer Larson and claims to have found a beer can about 150 feet away from the crime scene. The mystery beer can. Here we go. He's also collected some zigzag rolling papers. The mystery zigzag rolling papers. Yes. He claimed that he and other officers were combing the village, specifically for Vincent Cosey. What the fuck? Why? What other evidence did they have leading to Vincent Cosey other than Stephanie's friend Felicia saying that she thought she may have heard his voice on the phone? Someone that didn't even know his name. Okay, enough with Officer Letwitsky or whatever his name was. All right, here's Officer Larson. We've heard a lot about you, officer. He's an investigator with the village of Caledonia and asks to affirm rather than swear. I remember when this was a thing. People refused to swear because it was, quote, bad or something like that. I think it had something to do with the religious beliefs because someone claimed it was against the will of the Bible to swear. Something along those lines. No one seems to care anymore 15 years later. To each their own. He claims to have found a bullet in a pile of debris at the crime scene. He claims to have found a box of 45 rounds in Cosey's van, as well as a couple of loose 38 rounds. Wait, wasn't Cosey driving the car? When he searched the Chevy Celebrity, he found a marijuana blunt. There was mud on the brake pedal of the Celebrity as well. Just wait for the bombshell when this mud is discussed. The officer claims the blunt and the soil samples taken from the scene are not in the same containers that he sealed them in. Uh-oh. Houston, or Racine, we have a problem. Oh, no, we don't. Never mind. No one seems to care. Officer Larson then claims there was a lot of discussion among all of the officers at the scene that Vincent Cosey was the suspect. No blood, no ammo, no weapons in the Chevy Celebrity. Just a name that seemed to be on the lips of all the boys with badges. Boys with itchy trigger fingers and a name to halt said itch are never much of a good thing. And they all know they'll find him soon enough. Caledonia isn't a big place, and anyone who would be willing to help out Vincent Cosey isn't far away. All right, so I guess we're done with you, Officer Larson. You can step down now. Okay, so this will bring our coverage of the first half of Day 3 to a close. In case you're starting to get the feeling that there isn't a lot of inculpatory evidence introduced towards Vincent Cosey, just wait. You'll keep feeling like that. All right, AJ Army, we'll see you next week. Until then, remember to stay aware and stay strong and get involved.
The American Justice Podcast is owned and copyrighted by Atua Productions, LLC. Your host is Scott Pogensee, and your writer is C. Derick Miller. The theme music for the American Justice Podcast has been created and composed by Josh DeRosa. Atua Productions aims for this to be an interactive podcast where you, the audience, has a great amount of influence on the content of our shows. You can interact with us in several ways. First, and most preferred, is you can leave us a voicemail. Our phone number is 942-942-0444. Be sure to leave your name and the city you're calling from, along with whether or not we can use your voice on the air. If Facebook is more your style, you can log on to our Facebook page at facebook.com/American Justice Podcast. Feel free to leave a comment, or you can message us on Messenger if you have a more pressing question or issue. If you would like to blog about the show, then you can log on to AmericanJusticePodcast.com and tell us what you think there. You can find many of the documents discussed in this episode there as well. If you are a tweeter, you can also voice your opinion on Twitter at AJusticePodcast. If you would like to support the show, you can do so in a couple different ways. First, consider visiting our Patreon page at patreon.com/AJPodcast. We have different levels of support that include t-shirts, guest call-in spots, and early access to our podcast and YouTube shows. Next, you can like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to get notifications of when we publish episodes. We would also very much appreciate it if you could give us a 5-star review. If you have any comments about the show, or more importantly, any tips on the case we're discussing, please call 972-942-0444 and leave us a message. After all, if the subject of our podcast is innocent, that means someone out there is guilty. American Justice Army? Let's find them.